Tonight on Nation to Nation, Senator Yvonne Boyer's private member's bill continues to be examined in committee. Its aim is to make the consequences more dire for forced sterilization.
You shouldn't be sterilizing Indigenous women, or anybody without their consent, or coercing them into consent.
A well-known Saskatchewan columnist says the provincial government's opposition to the carbon tax is off base when it comes to First Nations who want to see climate change action.
They're blowing that up in all proportion when the real problem is the climate crisis.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Today, the Supreme Court of Canada is upholding a rule that requires band members of a Yukon First Nations to live in the community if they want to serve on council. Band member Cindy Dixon has been fighting the Vuntut-Gwitchin First Nation in court to have that requirement declared unconstitutional because it means elected to council or members that are elected to council must move back to the community within 14 days of winning a seat. Dixon has a son with medical issues that require him to live near a hospital, and this 200-person flying community is 800 kilometers from Whitehorse and does not have a hospital. Joining me today to talk about the Supreme Court decision is APTN reporter Danielle Paradis, who has been covering the story. Welcome to Nation, Danielle.
Hi, Fraser. Happy to be here.
Maybe you can just tell our viewers a little bit about what this case is about and how it ended up all the way at the Supreme Court of Canada.
Mm-hmm. So Cindy Dixon's story starts in 2018, but I'm going to take us a little bit further back to 1993, which is the date that the Vuntut-Gwitchin First Nation first had their self-government agreement with the Yukon Supreme Court. So at that point, they were able to establish a constitution, which they have. It's viewable on their website, and that enumerates the rights of the people who live in the community. Now we go forward to 2018, and Cindy Dixon, who does not live in community, she lives, as you noted, 800 kilometers south in Whitehorse, and she wanted to run on council. She has said she's spoken to APTN in the past, and she said that she really wants to make sure that the voices of people who are not in the community are still represented and that they might have different concerns. So she attempted to run in 2018, but her nomination was discarded because she did not meet the residency requirement. She appealed that to the Yukon Supreme Court. And then the judge there agreed with the nation that although it was a potential breach of Section 15 of the Charter, which is equality, that Section 25, the Indigenous rights, it prevents Section 15 from invalidating that residency requirement. Now it's moved on to the Supreme Court, where we've just got the decision today.
No, the decision talks about Section 25 of the Charter of Rights and collective Indigenous rights. What did the Supreme Court say about that?
This is the most that we've really heard about Section 25. So previously, although that has been in the Constitution, it's not necessarily been something that we've known exactly what that means, particularly where they reference other rights. So this gives us a little glimpse that perhaps Section 25 now means that nations who have self-government agreements, who have constitutions, may be able to apply their own election rights. And I know this has come up in other communities that we've covered at APTN. It doesn't necessarily mean that that this will absolutely allow people to set their own requirements. There's still unique steps that the Yukon First Nation has taken, especially with their constitution. So yeah, the discussion is still evolving. Since the decision is so fresh, we're still working on reaction as well. But I think that it is definitely adding some clarity on Section 25 that we didn't have before.
Now, moving back to this First Nation, do you think, what does it mean for this First Nation, and what does it have the potential maybe to divide those living on and off reserve?
I think that we could say safely that division has already existed. Even in what Ms. Dixon talked about regarding the concerns of community or people who are not living in community. So that's not anything new necessarily, but I think that we could see a real division as to whether or not this is fair, whether or not this is whether or not it's most appropriate to have people stay connected to their community, especially in situations like Old Crow, although Ms. Dixon grew up in Old Crow, she needed to move both for her son and also for work. So when you deal with remote communities, it's often very challenging for people to find work within those communities. And it is a pretty big ask that they have to stay in their community in order to run for council. That said, there's an argument on the other side that the VGFN's lawyers have talked about, which is, that importance to connection and land and keeping that ancestral land strong, as well as keeping people with skills in the community. So there really are two sides to this discussion.
And what do you think it says about the sovereignty overall of First Nations communities?
It's because VGFN specifically had the self-government agreement, which was validated by the Yukon Supreme Court, that might be a different situation than what other nations find themselves in. And the decision did not speak specifically to a nation that would be claiming complete independence from Canada, because that's not the situation here. The VGFN set up the agreement to fit within the Yukon Supreme Court, and that's what the Supreme Court cited. Specifically, they cited a paper from 1995 where Marie Ellen Lafond, now known as Marie Ellen Turple Lafond, and Peter Hogg spoke about creating the communities within the constitutional framework that we have. So I don't think we've answered that sovereignty question today with this ruling, but I think that it gives some question and some pause. And I think nations that have these agreements, if they're of the understanding that they're sovereign, they're going to be looking at this a little bit closer today, because that's not what the Supreme Court is saying.
Now, I know this decision just happened and it's early, and you mentioned you're sort of just trying to get reaction. But have you got any sense, even online or anything, of the reaction so far from people?
I think it's it's a Supreme Court ruling. It's somewhat dense. I think that people are still digesting this. I haven't necessarily seen any, I would say, like, informed reaction. I'm seeing the story pick up interest. But of course, it's a Thursday before a holiday, so it might be one of those slower news stories that picks up more towards the evening.
Right, I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion though in coming days, but we'll have to leave it there. But thanks again for joining us today, Danielle.
Thank you so much.
Up next, we'll have Canadian Senator Yvonne Boyer, whose private member's bill would specify forced and coerced sterilizations as an offense under the Criminal Code.
APTN presents a captivating journey into the heart of the North with our latest podcast, The Place That Thaws.
Some areas that used to be safe are no longer safe.
Hosted by me, Danielle Parody. Join us as we uncover the intricacies of life on a changing coast. Subscribe and listen to The Place That Thaws.
Joining me now is Senator Yvonne Boyer. Welcome to Nation to Nation, Senator Boyer.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So maybe you could first outline for our viewers just what is the main reason you decided to table your private member's bill?
Well, I had been asked by survivors for a number of years if I would consider putting a piece of legislation in that would criminalize the act of forced and coerced sterilization. And for several years, I really resisted it, because so many times we find the criminal code doesn't work the best for Indigenous people. And it wasn't until we had testimony from several of the survivors on a report tabled by the Senate Standing Committee on Human Rights that dealt with forced and coerced sterilization. And every one of those women asked for the criminalization of this act. And every one of the main body of women that had been sterilized had been asking for a number of years. And it was at that time I knew that I had to do it. And so we pulled together as best we could. We worked with the law clerk and studied the criminal code and put together the first iteration of this bill in June 2022. And that was the introduction of the bill. And so the bill has been carrying on through the Senate since.
Now I know that doctors are already not supposed to do this this action, or they're not supposed to do it. But so why is there a need to put it penalties specifically in the criminal code?
Well, there are provisions within the criminal code that forbids the act of forced and coerced sterilization without consent. There are consent rules in every province, and it's still happening. And it's happening because they're not listening to the women, or the Indigenous women, Black women, vulnerable people, and men as well sometimes are being coerced into sterilization, often because of a judgment call. And it's a judgment call that the doctor makes based on the fact that perhaps this woman has too many children, and I'm going to strongly suggest that she not have any more women. And this woman is Indigenous. And so there's an inherent bias within the system and discrimination and racism within the system that says, oh, that there's a birth alert on that baby. We're going to, really try to make sure that woman doesn't have any more children. So that's primarily what what we've been seeing, and this is what the bill targets. It's specifically targeting the act of coerced and forced sterilization, and the primary purpose of the bill is to directly stop sterilization without consent. So it has safeguards in it. There's nothing in this bill that is not already in the criminal code. And if we don't do something about it, the status quo will remain exactly as it is, and more women will be sterilized. The last woman that came to me that was sterilized was at Christmas time 2023. So we know it's still happening, and the more women hear about this, the more they talk to each other and they stand up for their rights. There's 5 class action lawsuits all across the country right now, and women are standing up for themselves and saying no. There's one little story, if you will let me tell it, about a young woman, and this is just in my general everyday working life. I checked into a hotel, and it was in the West, and it was late at night, and there was one person behind she was the clerk behind the desk, and I said, I'm checking in. She said, oh, hello, you're the senator of sterilization. And I said, well, I mean, I am a senator, but that, I do other work. I do sterilization is a topic I work in, certainly. But she looked at me and her eyes got big and the tears started coming out. And she said, they did it to me. They did it to me when I was 21 and I had 4 children. And now I'm 35. My children are grown and I have a new partner. And I can't have any more babies, and I can't afford IVF. So it was very telling. It's so pervasive. She was a young, beautiful woman, and with a beautiful partner and wanting to have more children. And she was stripped of that when she was 21. One of the witnesses that we had at the Senate was 24 years old with 2 children that had been sterilized against her will. And that was in 2022 or 21, I believe. So it's happening, and there's a very good reason that we have this bill. The bill is only one part of a big effort that has to take place. This bill needs to really deter doctors from sterilizing without consent. And there's another something very important I do want to talk about in relation to how pervasive this is. And sometimes we don't even know, sometimes doctors don't know, but this is just an example of something that we've heard and read about, and it's very alarming to people, young Indigenous women particularly. So, and it's about Dr. Andrew Kataska, And he has served as the Northwest Territories Medical Association president. He had years of practicing medicine at the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, at the U of Toronto, U of Manitoba, and UBC School of Population Public Health. He's published articles on Indigenous patients and informed consent and ethics. At the time, he was the former clinical director, he was the clinical director of obstetrics at the Stanton General Hospital in Yellowknife. And in July 2019, he diagnosed a 37-year-old Inuk woman, and he performed surgery to address a painful cyst on her right ovary at the Stanton General Hospital. She consented to the removal of her right fallopian tube and ovary, if necessary. He removed her right fallopian tube and ovary before he also removed her left fallopian tube and ovary and said, let's see if I can find a reason to take that left tube. And he left her sterile forever. So this is the doctor at the top of the food chain. A civil suit was launched against him and the Northwest Territories Health Authority in April 2021 for $6.5 million. There was an official complaint that was launched also with the Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority, who actually licenses physicians. At that time, the Board of Inquiry found that he violated responsibilities in the Code of Ethics and Professionalism, and he was suspended for 5 months. But he had already, his contract had expired, so that 5 months was already served. He was ordered to pay $20,000 in costs and had to complete an ethics course, and he's currently practicing medicine in BC. So you see how the whole concept of forced sterilization runs rampant. And unless there is a bill like this, perhaps he would have taken a step back and said, oh, I remember that criminal code bill that will penalize doctors for not getting proper consent. He did not get proper consent. He took that woman's left fallopian tube and ovary and sterilized her without consent. And there was people in the room that witnessed it as well. So these are very good reasons for having a bill like this.
Now, I just wanted to move for a second to the other end of the argument. I guess it's not really an argument, but what some of the criticism that's come up is that stiffening these penalties could have a chilling effect maybe on the quality of reproductive care Indigenous women currently receive. What's your answer to that?
Well, I think there's a really chilling effect right now because we have, well, my office has counted 12,000 women that have been sterilized against their will. And I've just been telling you about other women and probably women that are being sterilized right as we speak. That's a pretty chilling effect. And this bill is not meant to like penalize all doctors. It's actually, I think what the bill does, it criminalizes something that the bill does not criminalize something that isn't already there. Like we look at the assault provisions, but it does stand out from the current regime because it specifically looks, and the primary purpose is sterilization without consent. So we've heard that over and over again throughout the testimony. The bill was created to address the sterilization of Indigenous women and others who are vulnerable. And it aligns with what we know on the state of law on consent, and it paves the road for accountability for, pardon me, for physicians. There isn't anyone asking them not to do their job. And on the contrary, we're asking them to do their job and doing it safely. And most of them do, but there are a few dozens that don't. And based on the number of surgeries that they conduct, they can have really devastating consequences, as we see. And Nicole Rabbit showing us in her testimony that you saw as well. And I think it's important to be clear that the entire medical profession here is not the target of Bill 250, sorry. And it's basically, it's a course of conduct that has treated consent to this procedure either too casually or not at all. And that's the target of this bill. And as far as emergencies, I mean, we had during the testimony, we heard about emergencies, like what if there's, a testicular torsion? Oh my God, the doctor is going to be criminalized. Well, we also heard from many witnesses that the primary purpose of this bill is consent for sterilization. That's it. And the Canadian Medical Association reps were really clear that this bill would not interfere with their ability to perform procedures needed to save someone's life during a medical emergency. The bill's intended to give pause and make people reflect on the gravity of the procedure, not stop it from happening altogether, especially in cases of emergency. We also heard from the Department of Justice that said that within the definition of the bill, the sterilization procedure is for the primary purpose of permanently preventing conception. That's what the bill is about. It doesn't have anything to do with stopping doctors from emergency procedures. I asked Dr. Malhotra, who is a practicing physician. She said that I ask you to consider non-emergent consent and emergent consent. Emergent consent, clearly stated by the CPMH, states that the physician has the duty to provide immediately necessary care to save someone's life. And according to the Canadian Medical Protection Association, here's what they say: to the general rule that consent must always be obtained before any treatment is administered, there's an important exception. In cases of medical emergency, when the patient or substitute decision maker is unable to consent, a physician has the duty to do what is immediately necessary without consent. So the physician has a duty to save the life. We heard that from the medical people that in the testimony over the last couple of days. And so there's that, that's clearly what is very important, is the making sure that this will not interfere with any procedures that are in place currently to save people's lives.
Now, the community meetings I've covered, or sorry to interrupt you, I've noticed there's quite a bit of support from all parties, so that doesn't seem to be necessarily a problem. What are you expecting when it gets to the House? We did discuss this a bit before, but are you expecting it will pass through the House of Commons fairly rapidly once it comes out of the Senate?
Well, I'm an eternal optimist. And if I'm not, then I think it's better to be optimistic than not optimistic. So I'm optimistic that it will move through the House as quickly as possible. And I'm hoping we can get it to the House by the end of June. I'm fingers crossed. And I'm hoping that in September, the House can pick it up and move it very quickly, and it can become law in Canada as soon as possible.
Well, we'll have to end it there, but thanks very much for talking to us about this very important issue that you've taken on and brought to our attention, and to also the legislators' attention, and we'll be watching with interest to see what happens.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to come talk anytime.
After the break, Saskatchewan Star Phoenix columnist Doug Gutman is here to tell us what's on his mind.
I'm Kathleen Martins, a reporter with APTN News. Homeless, houseless, shelterless people, they aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? Hear their stories in my new 5-part podcast called Our Relatives. Listen on your favorite player.
Welcome back. For decades, Doug Gutman has been one of the top political columnists in Western Canada, often writing about issues that affect Indigenous peoples. He joins me from today and from his home in Saskatoon to talk about the latest goings-on on the prairies. Welcome back to Nation to Nation, Doug.
Thank you. Welcome back.
All right, maybe we'll start with former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Of course, as we know, passed away earlier in the month, and then his funeral was held past weekend in Montreal. What do you think that Indigenous people have been saying about the former Prime Minister's legacy?
Yeah, well, Brian Mulroney was in government for about a decade, and it was a very pivotal decade for First Nations people. We went through the Charlottetown Accord, the Meech Lake Accord, the Oka crisis, and other numerous things. So yeah, it was a very pivotal time, and there was a lot of negative comment about him. I thought that I would rather focus on some of the positive things he did, because nobody really was. And here in Saskatchewan, the federal government, provincial government, and FSIN negotiated what is at the time, probably still is, the largest single land claim in southern Canada. There were 27 First Nations that got treaty land entitlement. It brought close to $1 billion into the Saskatchewan economy. And today we're reaping the benefits of that. There's urban reserves, there's reserves that have, like my reserve has tripled its size, for example, and others. So that's what we look at back here in Saskatchewan, is that the treaty land entitlement agreement signed by Brian Mulroney and Premier Roy Romano really put us, was a major jump in economic and social development.
Okay, so I want to move next to another piece of recent news in Saskatchewan, and that is also that the Saskatchewan government has decided it's going to break the law and not remit the carbon tax. You hear a lot of negative feedback of the prairies generally on the carbon tax, but what do First Nations people think about this move?
Well, I don't know about First Nations people. A lot of them, it hasn't really, there's so many other issues. And if you look at the carbon tax, it's fairly benign. I mean, it's not that much money, but it's a political football. It's being kicked around like crazy. Um, really, First Nations people are more concerned about the state of the climate. We like, I was at a meeting recently where Northern Reserves were saying they can't get their trucks in on the ice roads because it's just too warm, and they can only haul like quarter loads and half loads. So there's a lot of building supplies and fuel and stuff that's not getting in. And then we had forest fires in the summertime. We have drought in the summer. Like, this is very serious, and the government or the opposition parties are not taking it seriously. They're taking it as a few cents on a liter, which it really basically is, and a liter of gas, and then they're blowing that up at all proportion. When the real problem is the climate crisis. And I know the big argument is that Canada can't go it alone. Of course we can't. We're a very small nation in terms of releasing carbon dioxide into the air, but by using, we can establish new technologies, and we can have moral authority on the world stage. So, it's to me, the climate crisis is one of the major crises facing First Nations people and Canadians, but it's just being left behind by, short-sighted governments that want to make a political hay over a few cents on a liter.
So I want to move now to the Auditor General released a report on First Nations and Inuit policing last week, and it finds that millions of dollars of federal money that was supposed to be spent on First Nations police services is going unspent, while First Nations police forces are telling us that they're struggling to meet their budgets. Is it time for Canada to move away from the RCMP when it comes to First Nations policing?
That's kind of difficult. On one hand, yes, it's good to see independence, but on the other hand, the RCMP has the infrastructure. They've got the training, and they've got the network and all this sort of stuff. So we need to work together with the RCMP and cooperate, but at the same time, we have to develop our independent police forces that deal with our own band First Nations. For example, a lot of First Nations are passing bylaws, and they're not getting properly enforced by the RCMP. If we had our own police force, we would be able to concentrate on some of these bylaws. And then there's the whole issue of, they're very, very personal issues right now facing our people, of drugs and, violence on reserves and stuff like that. And having an outside police force try to administer that is very difficult. Having a First Nations police force where they've got people that understand the issues and are familiar with the issues, they can go a lot further in calming down with some of these communities. The object of policing is community safety. It's not arresting all the people you can and packing the jails. It's building the communities up and making them safe, and just generally creating healthy places to live. And that's what our police forces have got to do, and we're not getting MP.
I also wanted to talk to you about last week, I think it was, or recently anyway, it was really revealed that the federal government is conducting a forensic audit of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. What do you think this means for the organization?
Well, I think it's a matter of concern. I mean, I know people in the FSIN aren't taking it as seriously as they should. I think it's a matter of concern for First Nations, because this sort of thing casts a pall all across First Nations band councils and district councils and or regional organizations. So we've got to, I hope they complete it and get it over soon, because it's going to. It's one of those things that tends to poison the well, kind of thing. There's so many people out there that complain about accountability in First Nations, and this just adds more fuel to the fire. So I think it has to be dealt with and brought to a close as soon as possible.
And maybe just sticking on that, I suppose a potential conservative federal government has promised to enforce the First Nations Financial Transparency Act. It was passed under the Harper government, as you know, but never really enforced under the Trudeau government. What do you think this would mean for organizations like the FSIN and other tribal councils and other governments?
Well, under the Harper government, funding for a lot of these organizations, well, it didn't dry up. It certainly was reduced, and there's a constituency out there that thinks that we're sort of welfare bums and living off the fat of the land, and we're not. But it's very easy for the Poilievre government to cut back on financing, really conduct more and more forensic audits, and basically circumvent a lot of our leadership by just going through the to the staff and to other people like that. So no, I'm quite other pressure groups, I should say, from the outside. So I'm quite concerned that in a year and a half, if Poilievre is successful and forms a majority government, we could find First Nations reliving Harper 2.0.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of talk these days about, I guess, change of government in Ottawa and sort of the forthcoming election. It's what people are talking about for sure. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, Doug. But as always, thanks for joining us on Nation to Nation.
Well, you're very welcome.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.
Hello, I'm Rick Harp, host of APTN News Brief, a daily podcast version of the nightly broadcast of APTN National News. Available on all major podcast platforms, APTN News Brief is your quick way to hear the headlines every weekday morning. Learn more at aptnnews.ca/podcasts.